Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and hey, it's episode 2. We did it. We got the first episode out into the world, and I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for the amazing response we got. People were very kind. We got more listeners than I frankly thought we would get from a first time podcast by some guy on the internet. So, everybody who listened, who liked, who shared, who told your friends, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for helping me get this thing started. And here we are at episode 2. So, hopefully, we can keep it going. A short one this week, but we have a great guest. Our guest is Daniel Kraus, and he's going to talk about his new book, Pay the Piper, which is excellent, and a very special episode of The Twilight Zone that both of us like very much. That'll be a great conversation. Since it is episode 2, I wanted to introduce a little segment here where we are a horror podcast, and I like horror. You like horror, presumably, if you're listening to this. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the horror stuff I've been taking in recently, maybe give you a couple of recommendations. On the book side of things, I am rereading Experimental Film, the novel by Gemma Files. Gemma does not write a lot of novels. She is a short fiction genius, but Experimental Film is one of her rare long form pieces, and it's worth every word. I'm not going to say too much about the plot if somehow you still don't know about this book, but I first heard about it from Stephen Graham Jones. I think I heard him somewhere say it was one of the scariest novels he'd ever read. And folks, he was not exaggerating. It is a very chilling, very imaginative, very fun book with roots in film history, which Gemma is an expert in. And it's got all the kinds of things that I love in a horror novel. So if you haven't read Experimental Film, go check it out. On the movie front, it is September 10th as I'm recording this. As of September 6th, this movie is in limited theatrical release, and I'm sure it'll hit VOD soon, but it's called Red Rooms. It is a Canadian horror film from Quebec about a woman who is obsessed in her own weird way with a serial killer. And that is all I'm going to say. Don't read anything about it. Don't look up the ending. Just go find Red Rooms and watch it. It is one of my favorite horror films of the year. It is brilliant. It is chilling. It made me stay up until 4 a.m. watching it and then stay up until 5 a.m. because I couldn't get to sleep after I watched it, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, those are my recs this week: Experimental Film and Red Rooms. So, that's enough of me rambling. Let's go ahead and move right into our interview with this week's guest, Daniel Kraus. Joining us this week for The Scares That Shaped Us is one of the most prolific and versatile horror authors of the last 15 years. You know him from books like Rotters, Scowler, The Shape of Water, The Ghost That Ate Us, and my personal favorite book of 2023, Whalefall. His new book is his second collaboration with the late, great George A. Romero. It's called Pay the Piper, and by the time you hear this, it will be in bookstores everywhere. Daniel Kraus, welcome to the show.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks.
I want to talk about Pay the Piper a little bit because based on what I've read about the book, I think it's in the jacket copy, that you found part of this manuscript when you were going through Romero's archives while you were working on The Living Dead. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. I mean, someone else would have found it. It's not as if I was digging under his house or something. uh, his archives were brand new at that point, and they had just been given to the University of Pittsburgh. And there were really 3 archives. It was from his wife, his daughter, and his business partner, all sort of put their resources into it. But I was the first kind of civilian to go through it before it had even been fully cataloged. And yeah, so I did come across it then, and it was a big surprise. just because, as far as I know, no one's ever heard of it. No one knew it was a project he was working on.
Yeah, I mean that's the most amazing thing to me. Like obviously he had a lot of stuff in his career that he wanted to do and never quite got to do. But the idea that there's a half-finished George Romero novel out there, I just want to ask you as a I know you're a lifelong Romero fan. So what's it like for you to A, stumble upon a lost Romero novel and B, realize, oh my God, I might be able to do something with this?
Well, I mean, when I found it, I was probably just coming off of finishing up the first book that he had left behind, The Living Dead. And that one was uh, not a surprise in the sense that it had been reported over the years that he was working on it. Getting to be the person to finish it was obviously, just a huge brain melter and an honor and a daunting task. So to find a second one, and by the way, final one, there's nothing else in the archives like it. There's no more novels anyway. Um, was like a mix. It was like, oh goody, look, there's another one, and it looks to be even better. And then a sense of, do I want to do this again? Because it was really hard. I've done various kinds of collaborations over the years, but the most difficult ones have been the Romero books, just because you don't have him there anymore to bounce ideas off of or ask, what do you mean by this? And so it involves a whole other level of kind of detective work or archaeologist work, just trying to figure out where he was going with all of it.
That leads me to the next thing I wanted to ask you is when you're doing something like that and you have, I mean, obviously The Living Dead, that was a life's work. There were so many
Right.
different aspects of his zombie mythology that he had built up for so many years. With this, you just have that, I would imagine. So
Yeah.
what was that detective work for you, and how much of the book is George Romero and how much of it is Daniel Kraus?
It's about 50-50. He had written, well, let me go back. So with The Living Dead, he had written a whole bunch of stuff, but it was all over the place. Like there was stuff that was clearly meant to be at the beginning. There was stuff that was meant to be at the very end. And he did leave some notes, not a ton, but he left like, several pages of notes of where some of the plot threads were going. So I had kind of a patchwork map of sorts. With Pay the Piper, there were no notes whatsoever. So the second half was completely up to me to figure out. But there was possibly more writing overall that existed of it. Like he had written a good solid half the book. Now, in the finishing of it, some of it got moved around. So some of the stuff that was in that first half, I moved later in the book. A couple characters I combined. I did various things that you do when you're revising a book. But yeah, he's at least half of it. All the characters, I think, all the characters come from his manuscript. As far as the detective work, it was such a wonderful and bizarre manuscript he left behind, just filled. Like the Living Dead was obvious in some ways. It was like, all right, here's his big book that in some ways was kind of finishing up the Living Dead cycle of movies, wrapping it up, doing things he couldn't do in movies. This one was just filled with so many strange, esoteric characters and details. And because I had done a lot of work with the previous book, learning about him, talking to his wife and all that stuff, I knew that this book was on site, that this book was filled with the things that he really loved, like his passions, which were not horror generally, were all present here. Like, and they're very much like what you would consider like 1950s boy enthusiasms. Like there were westerns and jungle adventures and Tarzan type of stuff and searching for gold and all these kind of things, and John Wayne movies, all these things
Mm-hmm.
thrown into the mix. Some of which were so specific and peculiar that they begged research. And so I would research these strange topics, and in the research would stumble across things that would be like, oh my God, that connects with that. this would have been all very clear in his head. If he had been around, I could just ask him what he was up to, but it took instead reading 2,000 pages of books to come up with that answer. That this connects with that, and it was very gratifying, but it was slow work.
So for listeners who haven't read anything about Pay the Piper yet, it is set in a deep, rural, poor swamp community in Louisiana, where the locals are haunted by this kind of legendary local creature known as the Piper. And I won't give it any more away than that. But I wanted to ask, Romero was famously a Pittsburgh guy.
Mhm.
You're a Midwest Chicago guy. Um, what was it like for you getting deep down into that, not just Louisiana, but like that corner of Louisiana?
Yeah, it was super fun. And this is another thing that I credit Romero's manuscript with, is that it would have never occurred to me to set a book down there. And that's the fun with collaborating, is you get kind of spiked with these ideas from somebody else and you have to kind of react to them. And I've spent some time down in New Orleans, but I've never lived there or anything. He clearly had done his research and clearly had spent some time there. So I went down there again specifically for the book and went down to the bayous, poked around various little strange restaurants, and I went as far as you can go on in a vehicle. After
Yeah.
that, I would have needed some sort of boat guide of some sort, which I didn't do. But I visited the battlefield. There's a lot of stuff in the book about the Battle of New Orleans and
Hmm.
Pirates Lafitte, which are all real things. But yeah, I mean, he had clearly done his research, and being a research heavy guy like I am, it definitely was inspiring for me to read up on all that stuff and then just really submerge myself into the sights and sounds and smells and the heat and the slime and if you're in the Bourbon Street, the vomit, and just like, it's a very sensory book, and I wanted, like, at every point, if someone runs into a shrub, I wanted to know exactly what kind of plant it was and how sticky it was, and I just got really, really into all these details.
Well, it's definitely a very sensory book to read. It really has that Louisiana Gothic feel to it, and it's also interesting because I would not have pegged either George or you for a book like this, but at the same time, it has a lot of those same societal thematic concerns that are laced through Romero's work, and it reads like a Daniel Kraus novel, even though you're getting deep into the Bayou accents and things like that. So, from your perspective, what do you think this book is offering to Romero fans and to Kraus fans that they probably haven't experienced before, apart from like obviously the setting?
Yeah, I think it'll be a kind of surprise for Romero fans, just because, I mean, his archive is filled with material, almost all of it screenplays and treatments for non-zombie stuff and a lot of non-horror stuff, and virtually none of it got made. But it was his big regret, and then he had a lot to be thankful for, and he was thankful for it. But his big regret was that he was never had the license to make these other kinds of things. And Pay the Piper is horror, so he was staying in the genre in which he was sort of pigeonholed, but it's also filled with all these other things he had interest in. So I think it's going to be surprising at first, but like you said, once you get into it, especially the latter part of the book, you start to see that he's up to his old tricks in a good way.
Hmm.
He's got really something to say here, uh, about kind of American culpability, or sort of uh, coming to terms and acknowledging sort of past wrongs in American history. Uh, and for me, something that he does in a lot of his work that I do in my own work, partly because I was influenced him by so heavily, is the idea of making it really not quite black and white, who's the good guys and who are the bad guys. He was often in his films putting key lines and words of insight and wisdom into the mouths of antagonists, and having his good guys do bad things. And this book, particularly when you get to the very end of it, it's thorny. Like, I think when you close this book, there's a bit of unsettling feeling to it. Like, you don't really know who has won, or has anyone won, and who should have won. Like, is it the team you were rooting for the whole time, or was there a switcheroo at some point? And maybe you should have been rooting for the monster. I mean, it's a troubling ending, and one that therefore I really like, because I love those endings where you're sort of thrown off the path you've been walking up to that point.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has that feel to it, and I'm excited for more people to read it. By the time this episode goes up, Pay the Piper will be out, so if you haven't bought it, go buy it. And before we transition into our story for this episode, I also wanted to ask, you just had a nonfiction book announced, speaking of
Yes.
George Romero, that's basically, as I understand it, kind of a memoir take on what Night of the Living Dead means to you. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what we can expect there.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever talked about it. Yeah, it's a project I've been working on for a little over a year. It's called Partially Devoured. And if you're a Night of the Living Dead fanatic, you'll recognize that phrase, which pops
Yeah.
up several times in the movie. And I started it on a lark. I was about to go on tour for Whalefall, and I had a few weeks where I was just doing press, and I was like, what should I do in these off moments? And so I started writing a shot by shot, sometimes frame by frame, reaction to Night of the Dead, starting at the very, very beginning and moving very, very slowly through the whole film. So it began as sort of film analysis, but quickly, very quickly, became something else. It was film analysis mixed with behind the scenes stuff, mixed with cultural analysis, mixed with very quickly memoir about how this movie has been with me since I've been 5 years old, and how it has changed with me, has meant different things to me at different ages, how it helped me at certain parts of my life get through some really hard times. It it is this sort of rabbit hole within rabbit holes of a book that is, on the one side, it's really linear, like it goes from the first second of the movie to the final second of the movie. But in other ways, every second is a new tangent to talk about something else, and it becomes this kind of vortex, this whirlwind of everything all at once in a kind of way. It's sort of the ultimate book on Night of the Living Dead that, in the midst of everything else, has original reporting in it too. That there are things in the book that have never been talked about before. There are biographical stories from people who were involved that no one's ever heard, and that are moving and heartbreaking. And I think it's a book people will find unexpectedly moving. It's funny, it's weird, it's strange, but it's also, I think, really heartbreaking in some ways. I'm obviously really excited about it.
I'm really excited about it too. And when it's out, we'll have to have you back on and we can deep dive Night of the Living Dead if you're not sick of that by then. But when I emailed you to ask what you wanted to talk about for this show, you were very gracious and offered some options. But one of the things you said was that Night of the Living Dead and one other story started it all for you. And that story is The Invaders, which is a season 2 episode of The Twilight Zone, which aired in 1961. And I was wondering if you could offer the listeners the little elevator pitch of what's happening in The Invaders.
Yeah. Invaders is about an old woman who lives alone in a dilapidated cabin, and a tiny UFO lands on top of it, and these little tiny spacemen come into the house and start, I don't know, badgering her, like shooting her with their tiny little guns and whatnot, and she has to try to defend herself.
Yeah, it's incredible. If you haven't seen it, go find it. one of the things I love about it, having rewatched it last night, is it is almost entirely silent. There's almost no dialogue. There's only one human character who moves around in this one location. It's a very conceptually tight episode written by the great Richard Matheson, who next to Rod Serling was probably the most important writer in the Twilight Zone. Since you said this started it all for you, and you've had a connection with Night of the Living Dead since you were 5, can we assume that The Invaders was also an early childhood encounter for you?
Yes, very much so. I think I encountered Night of the Living Dead and Invaders around the same time, so around 5 years old. If I had to give the edge to one of them, it would probably be the Invaders if saw one of them first. And I've talked about this in regard to Night of the Living Dead dozens and dozens of times on dozens
Mm-hmm.
and dozens of shows, but I've never got to talk about the Invaders, which I remember being kind of plopped down in front of the TV with my mom, in the same way I was for Night of the Living Dead, to watch a show I'd never heard of before called The Twilight Zone. It was the first of many, many times that she and I would watch the old Twilight Zones together. This would have been early 80s Iowa. I mean, it was on like, it was probably on like at 8 p.m. on Friday night. So it was on like there's a regular time that it was on our
Yeah.
TV. And I think it was very fortuitous that the very first one I saw was The Invaders. Like, I think for a 5-year-old, some of the other episodes would have been hard to follow, would have been too adult, or I would have gotten lost in the dialogue. But here's one that can be understood by a kid easily. There's no dialogue. It's just following very easy to follow action. And it's about what I think kids are really afraid of, which is sort of invasion of their safe spaces. Like it's essentially a home invasion movie or
Yeah.
home invasion show where you're alone in a house. And what's really scarier for a little kid than being alone? I mean, it's like the biggest fear, essentially. Being, even when it's bedtime and you're alone in your room and you're scared, it's all about being alone. So I think it makes sense that a lot of things in this episode really activated my fear response and my curiosity, and just the fact that you think about when you're 5 and you're watching things, you're probably watching kid shows largely and cartoons, and to suddenly have this black and white production that has no dialogue, that's just following an old woman around. It was just unlike anything I'd ever seen, and it's almost unlike anything I've ever seen since.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, even by the Twilight Zone standards, and they played with all different kinds of formats within that half hour and later hour. It's so interesting, and it's so well paced, because I mean, you were talking about the way a little kid would respond to it, and the way Agnes Moorehead, who plays the old woman, responds, and the way the episode is paced out. She sort of keeps retreating to different safe havens in her home. She finds, or she'll go for different weapons. Like, it feels very improvisational, even though it was scripted. Like, she goes into the closet and gets this big ladle that she's gonna hit the creatures with, and then she goes into her bedroom and finds one has snuck under the covers somehow and has popped up like a little blob. um and I think too that the idea, they're almost toy-like.
Oh yeah.
These spacemen, they have this very toy-like quality,
But they walk like
which,
wind-up toys.
yes, they walk like wind-up toys, which gives it a whole different cadence that I think if they had been more naturalistic, it wouldn't have been as scary. But my favorite thing in watching it was the sound design,
Hmm.
because it has incredible sequences of tension where there is music. The music will come in occasionally, but there are incredible sequences where the music just drops out, and she's sitting in a dark corner of her house, which, by the way, is lit only by candlelight. She has no electric lighting, so occasionally a flame will go out and she'll be left in even deeper dark, and she just hears this little pitter patter of
Yeah.
feet, and she's trying to track where it goes. Do you have a favorite moment or a favorite element that stands out to you, or is it just the whole episode for you?
I think watching it again last night, I mean, my memory of it before rewatching it last night, is more just, the feeling of being encroached upon by something. I'd have the same feeling as if you were in a cabin and you saw a couple rats or something, and you're just like, oh shit, I'm becoming encircled here. Last night, my favorite moment was the one that you were just talking about, where there's one in the bed, and she kind of wraps it up in a sheet and then just slams it repeatedly, and it's such a brutal moment, and it's kind of echoed again at the very end where she's smashing the UFO, and she's just like, as she's smashing it, you can tell she just kind of is losing her mind, and she's not even looking at what she's hitting anymore. Um, it's it's shocking and really fun to watch how quickly things go wrong. Like Twilight Zone episode is what, 22 minutes,
Yeah.
and like by the end of it, I mean, the beginning of it, she's just like going about her day. She's making some soup, and by the end of it, she's like almost insane. And it's like how quickly things went south for her.
Yeah, it's an incredible like Agnes Moorehead is great, but it's also I would love to get my hands on the script
Mm-hmm.
and see what Matheson did with that teleplay. Like obviously he wrote a lot of great Twilight Zones, but the patience involved in just letting one character go through that piece by piece by piece by piece, and it's building to something, and I'm what, it's a 60 something year old episode of TV, but I'm not going to spoil the twist. Go
Okay.
watch it. You should
All right.
watch it. Everyone go watch it. I love high concept horror stories anyway, and the fact that in 1961 they made this with one location, one set, two little spaceman creatures, a flying saucer, and one actor. It's so timeless. Like it is absolutely a perfect little story. Um, so talking about it in terms of your work, as I was watching her go through all of these different obstacles and all hell breaking loose, I couldn't help but think about Whalefall,
Hmm.
which is obviously much more complex and much more character driven in the way that you learn things about your hero. You don't just see them wandering around a house. I couldn't help but wonder if like you caught the bug for like one day I'm going to do a single location guy trapped in a thing story. But that may just be me projecting because I love Whalefall so much. So I'm wondering what do you think rubbed off on you from this that applies to your work now?
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, what else was a one location movie was Night of the Living Dead.
This is
Um,
true, yeah.
so I do think that take the Night of the Living Dead and Invaders, and you are talking about two productions that are largely single location. And I think, to this day, I am a sucker for a single location movie. Anytime they do kind of a film play, whether it's Glenn Ross or I think it was called The Humans that came out a few years ago.
Yeah.
Like,
Good one.
I'm just a sucker for that because I always feel like it's, as an artist anyway, it's a real test of your mettle to remove all the things that you usually do to tell a story and say all you've got is one room, and are you good enough to tell an engaging story with just some people in a room. Like I think Tarantino tried this with The Hateful Eight.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have the budget and the ability to do all sorts of things, but can I pull off this little trick? And I think it's whenever I hear about a filmmaker doing it, like Lucky McGee did Old Man, that was very much in this style, and I really really like that movie too. No, really though, you've hit upon it because there's almost nothing that'll get me to see a movie faster than a single location. So I think yes, and you don't get, of all the single locations you can think of, to make it more dramatic, you make them smaller and smaller. Like there's the movie We Have to Do Something. Is that
We Need to Do
We
Something?
Need to Do
Yeah.
Something, where it's in a
Yeah.
bathroom, and then tighter than that is probably Buried with Ryan Reynolds.
Uh-huh.
And Whale falls right up there among the smallest of the small spaces. We are in a whale's stomach, which is despite what Pinocchio tells you. It's actually very, very small. Yeah, so that is probably what I took from it.
You've also written you've written books for younger readers as well as books for adults in kind of the horror space. And I'm always fascinated because I was not a kid that was allowed to experience horror. I was in one of those houses where it was banned, and all the horror I could really get was the chapter or two of a Goosebumps that I snuck at school.
Yeah.
What do you think, going through experiencing this story and Night of the Living Dead and stuff like that at the age of 5, what do you think that gave you as just in terms of an imagination growing and taking shape that you might not have gotten if you had seen them when you were 15, 20, whatever?
Right. I mean, and having written partially Devoured, I mean, I've essentially written a whole book about this question. Like, what did it do? And I think part of what it did was it established this sense, this pattern of I can get through something scary and then feel good about myself, like, because I did that. And then, I had a very rocky relationship with horror, and I think a lot of people do growing up. And there were years where I absolutely loved it and years where I was too afraid to watch it, and it kind of fluctuated. But I kept coming back to it. And I think there was always this sense of I know this stuff bothers me, but I want to get through it, in the same way that maybe it's almost like immersion therapy. Like, I'm afraid of snakes, so I'm going to start handling snakes. Well, you get into 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. I'm essentially a very fearful kid at this point, who's afraid of a lot of things, and there's bullies and there's all sorts of awful things going on in that regard. And yet, because I have this background of horror, I can take the hardest stuff off my local video store aisle, whether it's Evil Dead 2 or even Faces of Death or something, and I can watch that and I can get through it, and my bullies can't even do that. Like, it was a sense of training myself to be harder and tougher with horror. And I don't know if obviously saying it out loud, I'm not sure that's entirely a positive or not. Like, I'm sure a therapist could look at that and say maybe you weren't dealing with problems in the best way, but it felt like a decent way to deal with it at the time. And I feel like, I don't know, I think it was a positive. I think horror was always there for me, and two things that were always on TV were Twilight Zone and Night of the Living Dead, and those were, particularly in the pre-video store days, those were the only things I could really count on to always be around.
So with that in mind, are there other Twilight Zone episodes that really imprinted on you that are maybe secondary to the Invaders, but still super important to your work?
I mean, I was a big sucker for the very Romero-ish ones, which were like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, the one I'm forgetting the name, where everyone wants to get into a guy's nuclear bomb shelter, and everyone turns against each other because they all want to get inside. Only one guy on the block has a
I'm blanking,
but yeah. So there's a number like that are essentially about mob mentality, which is ultimately at the end of Night of the Living Dead, sort of the real bad guy at the end of that movie. So I think those all meant something to me. The Invaders was the creepiest one to me. There's another one that's not as well known called Night Call that I've always found very scary. To me, it's the scariest of the Twilight Zones. It's about another old woman. I think there's 2 people in it instead of 3, and she's getting phone calls from her dead husband, and it's very, very scary.
Isn't that also a Matheson episode? I'm trying to look this up now.
I don't remember.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's a Matheson.
Yeah.
And I remember it because someone, I think Grady Hendrix, was on the Talking Scared podcast recently talking about a Stephen King story called Sorry, Right Number that has a very similar flow to it, which King was obviously deeply influenced by Matheson. And hey, speaking of Matheson, like, did he have an impact on you beyond the Twilight Zone? Were you a Matheson reader?
No, not much. I mean, I've read some of him in adulthood, but as a kid, I wasn't aware of him, you
Mm.
know, and I wasn't paying much attention to the credits of the Twilight Zone. Um, when I was
Yeah.
in my childhood, I was watching a lot of Richard Matheson without knowing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of us came through it that way. What do you think what do you think about the timelessness of the Twilight Zone? Because I got to tell you, in my day job, I write a lot of articles about the history of the Twilight Zone, the way different episodes were pulled off, the way different storytellers influenced the direction of that show. And The Invaders is just as effective now as it was in 61. Like, I'm 38 years old. I'm sitting there watching it with my teeth clenched, wondering what's going to happen here. Um, why do you think it still works so well?
Man, it is hard to figure out. Like, if it were a single movie, if it were Night of the Living Dead, you could say it was sort of lightning in a bottle. Like it was
Hmm.
this alchemy that was you can't repeat. But it wasn't. It was this show with 162 or something like that
Hmm.
episodes, and there's so many of them that feel timeless. Like, how did they pull it off again and again? That's the mystery of it. There's something about that. First of all, I think the black and white is key. There's something about the black and white cinematography um, that's just always so inherently spooky. I don't know how else to say it. I
Hmm.
wonder how much mileage they get out of the intro music because it's the only thing that's the same in all of them. I wonder if it's somehow spitting you out with a sort of uncanny feeling. That it's very spidery and strange. Beyond that, it's really difficult. I feel like you have to somehow give it to Serling and Matheson and a few other consistent creators behind it of somehow maintaining the same mood. I know as a kid and as an adult too, the fact that Serling will show up as the narrator, like even that's weird and kind of uncanny in a way. Is like, why is this man suddenly narrating this in person, stepping onto the set? I mean, this is me just talking about a lot of things that I like about it, but the real answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of my life wondering why the episodes work so well. I can't figure it out. Do you know?
I don't know that I do. And in part because if you dig into the history of the show and how some of these things got made, it was so haphazard. They were just kind of scrambling, even when it was a successful show. They were just trying to get it done every week, which makes the craft element of it that much more compelling, especially in an episode like this. And I can see a television executive looking at something like The Invaders and going, okay, so I need one big prop and two little creatures, and everything else is just a house set. Okay, yeah, green light, make that.
But I can also see someone today being like, no, absolutely not. No
Oh
dialogue.
yeah, I can't imagine pitching that to a TV executive now for sure.
So maybe that's it. Maybe it was part of just Serling at the time having the muscle to get some of this stuff done. And of course, there's a lot of I would say that the home run rate for Twilight Zone is really high, but like there's some stinkers in there, and he would try some comedy and do weird things. I think a lot of maybe executives would put the kibosh on today, but he did seem to have a decent amount of rope to play with.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how much, and it's a really nice blend of adaptation
Mm.
of a lot of great sci-fi and horror stories from that time and original stories, whether Serling was writing them or Matheson was or whoever. There's this really nice, and I don't know if he did that on purpose. Like, let me find dependable material and then let me just take chances. But it's yeah, Twilight Zone. We're coming out now on this show. Hot take: Twilight Zone,
Huh.
pretty good show.
Well, you know, as we were sitting here talking, I had another connection in my head that something that feels like the Invaders that I saw as a little more like an adolescent was Gremlins, in particular the scene where the mom is in the kitchen fighting the Gremlins.
Yeah,
That feels like the Invaders.
It really does, yeah.
There's various little beings, and she's having to use kitchen implements to fight them.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even that moment in the Invaders where she realizes that one of them has taken one of her knives,
Mm-hmm.
and then she has to contend with that. And yeah, it's I would love to ask Joe Dante. I mean, obviously he was a Twilight Zone guy, but I would love to ask him if he had that in mind when he put that together. That's an amazing connection. It also made me think of, did you see a film that came out last fall, I think, called No One Will Save You?
Oh yeah, I mean, but
Yeah.
Brian is doing the Whalefall movie.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Congratulations on that. I'm so looking forward to the Whalefall movie.
Yeah, I think that's another great, mostly one location. Boy, that's a really great one. I don't know why I didn't think of that.
Yeah, that's a good that was what I was thinking of while I was watching The Invaders, was that if you haven't seen it, it's Caitlin Dever, is a young woman in a house by herself, and aliens, like proper gray aliens,
Yeah.
the kind you see everywhere, descend on the house for unknown reasons, and it's creepy and fun and also mostly dialogue free.
Oh yeah, totally. In fact, as soon as we're done here, I'm gonna text Brian and see if that was an influence because it's a perfect match.
Yeah, it really kind of is. Yeah, that would be cool to see if Brian Duffield was channeling Agnes Moorehead into Caitlin Dever. That would be great. We are coming up to the end of our time, and I know I got to let you go. So before we say goodbye, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to plug whatever you want to plug. Let people know where to find you. I know you've got a book tour coming up.
Yeah. I guess when this drops, I'll probably be in the middle of it. A lot of events in September and October. So I'll be all over the place. You can go to danielkraus.com and click on the news tab, and that'll have all my appearances. So yeah, I guess I'd mostly plug Pay the Piper, my new book with George Romero. You know, most of the bucket list things that I would have wanted to do in my life, I have miraculously crossed off with one exception, and that's to somehow work with Twilight Zone. And a Jordan Peele show was still going. I would try to make inroads there, but not yet. Not yet.
Hey,
that remains to be tackled.
I think that show is still under the CBS Viacom Paramount umbrella somewhere. So anybody listening to this over there, Daniel Kraus, get in touch. Let him do his Twilight Zone dream
Yeah,
project.
come on, people.
It will be worth it. Daniel Kraus, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. And everyone go buy Pay the Piper. It's great.
Thank you.
Thanks once again to Daniel Kraus. Pay the Piper is in stores now. It's excellent. You should pick it up and be on the lookout for more news about his nonfiction project, Partially Devoured. I know I will be. For more on our show, you can go to thescaresthatshapedus.com. That's where you'll find links to our social media, ways to contact us, and of course, a roundup of our previous episodes. You can also find the podcast pretty much everywhere you get your podcasts. We're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're on Amazon Music, we're on YouTube. Just look around, you'll find us. If you do find us and you like the show, please like, subscribe, review, rate, tell your friends. It'll help us grow the show, help us get more and more fun guests on to talk about the scares that shaped them, and help me to keep rambling about horror, which is all I've ever really wanted to do. Thanks once again for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and you've been listening to The Scares That Shaped Us.